Welcome to this installment of Brave New World on ContextTV. So 2020 marks the 20-year anniversary of my career in media, and Watch Mojo turns 15. So it's an interesting year for many reasons, made even more interesting, obviously, with COVID, which is a weird segue, perhaps. But so when anybody, whether you're an employee, an owner, a shareholder, an analyst, whatever, when you look at COVID, you do kind of ask yourself, is this like 2008? Is it like 1987? Is it like 9/11? Is it like the 1929 Great Depression? Is it like the 1918 Spanish flu? And there's frankly a little bit of all of that. It's this crazy cocktail that has a little bit of all that, creating a very unknown and uncertain future. But then I also just focus in throughout my career on how media reacted and how advertising reacted coming out of the 2000 Nasdaq stock market meltdown, the dot-com bubble bursting, which were related, as well as the following year, 9/11, and then obviously 2008, the Great Recession, limited more to maybe finance, but again, finance tightens, everything else is affected. We also had in the online video space, the 2011, like maybe not correction, reset, whatever you want to call it, which I could get to. So when you fast forward to COVID, how is that similar, different, and what is the impact on advertising? So in 2001, this was obviously, in 2000 and 2001, after the dot-com bubble grew throughout the late 90s, pets.com, the first day that the first day that Jesus Christ, William Shatner, what's that Priceline? The first day that Priceline did their IPO, their market capitalization was greater than the entire transportation industry led by the airlines. Kind of made no sense. So that was clearly a bubble. It burst. Over time, the same dot-coms that people kind of laughed at, some of them did become dominant businesses, none more so than Amazon, obviously. But when Nasdaq crashed and the dot-com bubble burst, you did have this regression to the mean and this flight to quality. And so the magazines of note, who initially were most under attack relative by the internet startups, they're the ones that kind of they thought they were having the last laugh. And I think that gave them a false sense of security that print would be fine, magazines and newspapers. So when the 2008 Great Recession came, which was led by finance, but again, finance is more so than many other things a bit of a domino effect. It ultimately accelerated history, and print really never recovered after that. A lot of publications, magazines either scaled back, cut circulation, cut frequency of publishing, or just shut down and went digital. Newspapers even more so. I think newspapers, that was really the death knell, in that newspapers, the ones that were smart, kind of took on more of a digital first mindset, focused on subscriptions. And yeah, I would say like the idiot ones were the ones that when they did like a private equity recap, they just, squeezed the lemon, milked it until they ended up more or less dying. So that accelerated history because that advertising revenue never came back to print. It just basically went to digital. TV proved a lot more resilient. And I think the reason for that, and I've covered this throughout my career, is relative to print, especially, TV is technology, right? I mean, if you think of the very first creators of movies, they fled the East Coast to go to the West Coast, not just to get sunnier skies, but to run away from Thomas Edison's patents. So they were the original disruptors. And so they've always had to understand technology to sight, sound, and motion, combine it and bring it to fans, whether through television sets or on the big screen. So I actually think that to disrupt print was pretty easy because you could take articles and reinvent them pretty seamlessly online, but video was always more challenging. And so in 2008, I think what the Great Recession did is, especially with things like Hulu, which were disruptive and then maybe even held back, it never really reached its true full potential because their owners had an economic incentive to still keep the genie back in the bottle. I think in many ways 2008 just kind of maybe forced some decision makers in TV to embrace the web more. And I think then from the 2008 to 2019 reality, yeah, you had younger executives who either themselves grew up online or who kind of saw YouTube's dominance and Netflix dominance and AVOD and SVOD respectively. And they kind of just sort of got religion. And what you saw was, even though it was a lot of resistance, they did keep their content to a certain extent under their control, so that when that content ended up going over the top direct to consumer, they still were, they had a seat at the table, to put it mildly, in terms of then, how do you split up the pie? And then ultimately, I think sports was the big wild card, where you still had live sports fundamentally limited to television. So unlike print, that just over time got decimated and each shock hurt it dramatically, in many ways TV came out stronger because of sports and because of just the technical nature of that programming out of 2008. And I would say that they did play their cards relatively right, and bought themselves enough time as distribution platforms kind of blurred and screens became interchangeable. You could see Game of Thrones on your iPhone and you could project your YouTube shows on your smart TV. They actually were going to come out of this as the leaders, if you think about it, especially with the Vices and the BuzzFeeds and the Voxes, kind of, getting sidetracked in 2017, and people realizing, well, those guys are not going to take over the future of television. The television guys will likely be the masters of television going forward because they just know how to do that better. I think COVID changes all that, but for many different ways. The same way that we said in 2008 finance had a domino effect, I think COVID killing travel and ultimately gatherings of people will sideline sports long enough that it will create a force majeure in some ways, that it just throws that whole model on its head. If you're DAZN, you've already come out and said that, look, we're not going to pay the leagues for these rights, that we're not getting anything back in return, and that's going to lead to some litigation. And I think if you are Amazon on the sideline, you're waiting maybe to see the spillover to step in and maybe get some of those rights when they come back, because you got the balance sheet to do it. You're not under the same pressure that a DAZN is, let alone ESPN, and especially ESPN when all of Disney is under siege. So the flip side to that is not just that sports is not there. The way business is done is, to quote Eric Schmidt, who worked alongside Larry Page and Sergey Brin as the former chairman of Google. He said, quote, advertising is the last bastion of unaccountability in corporate America, end quote. And he's right. Advertising has embraced programmatic, which makes it more easy to buy. But there's still not that much logic. As somebody said, back in the day when Yahoo was a dominant portal, nobody ever gets fired for buying ads on Yahoo. And that's fundamentally true. But so the way advertising works is that, greasing the wheel and whatnot. So if you go to Cannes and you go to the upfronts, it's this old way of doing things that nobody is going to have the courage to say, this makes no sense. Warren Buffett once said about newspapers, he goes, if life started today, I'm paraphrasing, he goes, if things started today, nobody would say, hey man, let me get a bunch of kids, we go up, we cut up a tree, we come put it in this plant, we then take this article that we put it on this paper, and then we hire other kids to buy trucks and deliver these newspapers. We would just go it online. It would be a no-brainer. So advertising is the same way. The upfronts were just this big boondoggle. Cannes was just this big boondoggle where people meet, they catch up, they drink a lot of rosé wine and a lot of martinis that we can now do on virtual happy hours. And so without that, kind of racket still in place, I think if and when advertising returns, and it will return, I just think that naturally people are going to question the efficiency and the effectiveness of buying television advertising, especially because OTT, direct-to-consumer, AVOD, SVOD, a lot of buzzwords there, but because that has basically changed what the definition of TV is. I'm recording this on an iPhone and you'll watch it wherever. But this is basically TV to, what we call TV, this is TV to somebody, the next generation. So very long story short, I think that the way, I'm always wary of quoting Lenin, but when Lenin said that war is an accelerator of events, Basically, some have said that COVID is the latest war. We were investing almost trillions in military to fend off nuclear annihilation. But really, the main war is health. It's this pandemic. And I think this will just accelerate things. And I don't see a return of advertising to TV the way that it was. That $75 billion ad market that we've alluded to forever in TV, the dam has been broken. And when it will flow, a viewer, whether you're watching this on your mobile, on your iPad, on a smart TV, or in an airplane, when airplanes resume operation, it's, based on the information that advertisers will have on you as a viewer and this show and the metadata and the topics that we discuss, there will be a more efficient, effective way of reaching, equilibrium of what are you as a viewer worth to a given advertiser. That has nothing to do with whether you are watching this on TV or not. And COVID is that disruptive shock to the system that will just reset everything in many ways and force change because generally people are resistant to change.